Welcome to another episode of Forbidden Films.
This is a podcast about the movies they won't make anymore. I'm Barry Germansky, a film producer.
And I'm Wayne Kramer, a writer and director. Today, we're taking a deep dive into one of my favorite subjects and favorite movie series of all time, the James Bond films, focusing on the early 60s and 70s, actually. And I have loved this series since I was a young boy, maybe 6 or 7, growing up in South Africa and seeing Goldfinger for the first time on 16mm at a children's birthday party. That was about the only way that I could see Bond movies at that time, because once they played in the movie theater and I was too young to see the early ones, I wouldn't have the opportunity to see them again unless somebody invited me to a birthday party or there was a James Bond festival rerun in theaters, which was very rare. But it did happen one time, and I saw maybe a couple of them, like Dr. No, Diamonds Are Forever, and Thunderball, I believe I saw that way. But for the most part, I used to see them at birthday parties. So I wasn't seeing Bond movies that often because I'd go to or have my own birthday parties. There'd be like 5 of them a year. Not everybody rented a Bond film.
So whose idea was it to reserve them for birthdays? For
my birthday party, it was my idea.
Oh, okay.
But Bond was very popular among young kids in those days. And I'm talking like between, at that time, 6 to 10 years old. It was the go-to kind of movies. You would start out with like 1-hour television episode from the US, which they called TV shorts in South Africa. And there would be Manic, Star Trek, The Saints, Hawaii Five-0. And in my case, when I was younger, Batman. I loved the 1960s Batman series.
Same here.
So the first Bond movie that I saw at a birthday party was Goldfinger. And I had heard about James Bond from friends, or my father occasionally talked about it. And I was really intrigued to see it. And when Goldfinger started and Sean Connery first comes on screen, I was like, is that James Bond? It didn't, in my mind, that wasn't who James Bond was, because while Sean Connery was an amazingly handsome, virile guy, he has kind of a very interesting, angular look. And in my mind, I almost probably imagined a James Bond closer to Roger Moore. But 10, 15 minutes into the movie, I was like in the Sean Connery camp. I was enthralled. And later on, I saw You Only Live Twice. That was at another birthday party of mine, and From Russia with Love. And I mean, I was so in the tank for Bond. But the thing that I want to emphasize was it was really difficult for me to see James Bond back then. We didn't have television in South Africa at the time. And so there was no Bond movie turning up on TV. Obviously, there was no easy.
Which is how I saw them for the first time, by the way. It was on television.
Yeah, in the horrible pan and scan version. So in fact, when I saw James Bond on 16mm, they had the CinemaScope lenses attached for the widescreen ones. And they were in the correct aspect ratio and actually in film resolution. So in a way, I'm happy I did see them in that way versus the sort of horrible pan scan and all the TV commercials, all the TV commercials that would be slotted into them. So in South Africa in those days, you had the equivalent of 16mm film rental shops, which were the same as your home video rental stores that opened up late all over the world. Except it was very expensive, and you needed to, for the most part, own your own 16mm projector, which my family were quite poor, so we never had a projector, and that's why I didn't get to see that many films that way, unless I was invited to somebody's home. But on occasions of birthday parties, you could rent the projector. And, you know, that whole rental and renting a film, it was quite a lot of money for the day for my family, so it didn't happen that much. But to circle back to why we're doing this period of James Bond film, I feel like through the lens of today, and this really disturbs me, the series, especially the early films, the Connery films, the Moore films, they seem to have been targeted by the virtue signaling crowd as the original sin of misogynists and sexists, completely ignoring the context and the era of the films, and that women were just as huge fans of Bond as men in those days. Certainly times have changed.
And they're also ignoring the tough women that were in the films.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. But it seems like we've become so uptight in this current climate about like flirtatious behavior or fantasy-driven scenarios like Bond's supernatural ability to seduce women into bed with just a look, pretty much. And the immortal offense by today's moral majority of Bond giving the occasional woman a pat on the butt incidentally not strangers, but women who are lusting after him on screen. It seems to be like Bond is seen as this quaint, this problematic behavior from a different era. And if you contrast James Bond from the Sean Connery era, which is my favorite era,
Same.
to what Bond has become today, and let's say by closing out the Daniel Craig era, while I think Casino Royale is up there with From Russia with Love is my favorite Bond film of all time, I can't pick one over the other, and I like that it spans both eras. I think the Daniel Craig period was very sexless and sort of sucked out some of the joy of the Bond sexual relationship that he had with the women in the films.
I
And
couldn't agree more.
Yeah, and Craig was a great Bond. I'm not one of those people who slam Daniel Craig for being this or that. I think he was a really effective James Bond, and that's why Casino Royale works so well, because there's this great sexual chemistry between Daniel Craig and Eva Green in that film. And it's sexy, and Bond is still also, he's using other women, sleeping with other women. But then the movies that followed after seem to put him into more of a monogamous relationship with the Madeline character he ends up having a child with. And it just felt so un-James Bond to me in that sense.
Oh, definitely. James Bond shouldn't get married too often, put it that way.
Yeah, I think, when we talk about it, and we'll talk about On Her Majesty's Secret Service, it is a singular James Bond film in my mind. It's an absolute masterpiece. But let's sort of start at the beginning with Bond. And
that's a good idea.
Let's kind of go through the movies in the order they were made. And we'll do pretty much since the 60s and 70s, we'll go Dr. No through to Moonraker. And so let's go back to where it all began with Dr. No. And I'm interested in hearing your thoughts about that.
Well, Dr. No, the novel, is actually my favorite of the James Bond novels. And the film does depart substantially from the source material, but I still love what the film is. And I love Joseph Wiseman's portrayal of Dr. No. I think he does a great job as the first on-screen.
We should point out that Joseph Wiseman was a Jewish man.
Yes.
Playing half Chinese, half German Dr. No. So that in itself would be a huge no-no today. It would never even be even remotely contemplated, and in fact would cause the movie in itself to be canceled right out the gate.
Yes, which I think would be improper. I think that the performance he gives is great.
Fantastic.
Sort of by any standard. And when you also consider he's the first of the official James Bond villains in the official Harry Saltzman, Albert R. Broccoli series.
And he looks the role. It's not for, I never doubted that he had Chinese heritage in him for 1 second. And, it's almost like we're going to be accused of promoting blackface here. But, it's acting, and I certainly wouldn't promote blackface. And obviously, if I was directing James Bond today and we were doing a reboot of Dr. No, I certainly would cast a real Chinese actor. But it doesn't take away from the fantastic Joseph Wiseman performance. And I don't know if anybody even questioned that until the last couple of years.
Yeah, and I wasn't even aware because I saw the movie before I read the book, and I wasn't even 100% aware that he was supposed to be half Chinese. Like when I first watched the movie, I just thought he gave a great performance. I didn't realize that he was mixed race or anything like that because I saw the movie.
He talks is it the movie or the book because I think he kind of talks about, wasn't he a member of the Tongs?
Yeah, but it's very brief. Yeah, but the thing is, if you're only 5 years old and you see the movie for the first time, you're not picking up on all those little details,
Right.
So okay. I didn't even realize that until I read the novel, and then it's much more clear in the novel. But yeah, I think he gives a great performance. I like the fact that he's urbane, and that, contrasts his villainy, because we often expect, a villain to be, uncouth and not civilized, but he's hyper civilized and just engages in barbaric behavior to a certain extent. So I think he gives a great performance. It's subtly tongue-in-cheek. Ken Adam does a great job with the sets. I love the aquarium that he has that magnifies the fish.
I mean, that's where it all started, with that Ken Adam vision for these slick, modern-looking Bond sets that become the standard of the series. I was thinking to myself the other day, who was the most valuable behind-the-scenes player of the James Bond series? And I would go, it's either Ken Adam or John Barry. And of course, because of my love of John Barry, and John Barry was tangentially in Doctor No. I mean, his Bond theme is all over the film,
That's right.
even though it's credited to Monty Norman, but
Yeah, I still
really,
consider it a John Barry film.
it's absolute. I am not afraid of saying it. The James Bond theme, despite however many lawsuits they've been through, is John Barry's. And I met John Barry on a few occasions. I had lunch with him when I was in my
Which is
I
beyond
was
cool.
yeah, my mid 20s. And I made the mistake of saying, even though Monty Norman composed the James Bond theme, your music, I didn't even get the words out of my mouth. And he looked at me and he said that I composed the James Bond theme. And to somebody, and this was pre-internet days, so I didn't have access to any information about the controversy of the James Bond theme. I had always seen it on the soundtracks credited to Monty Norman. I never questioned it, although it always sounded like John Barry music to me. And he went on to say that he basically, did that theme from scratch. I think there's like dum da da dum. Monty Norman borrowed that from some unproduced stage play or something, and everybody thought it was terrible involved in the production. And at a last minute bid to sort of salvage the soundtrack of the movie, the musical soundtrack, someone knew or heard of John Barry, and he was this upcoming musician in the UK who had a very hip sound for the time. And they approached him, and Barry took that couple of notes of melody line and just created everything. The vamp, all of that stuff is his. The vibe, and he's credited on screen with the arrangement or something of the Bond theme.
Yes.
But it's really his theme. And I love the story that John Barry tells that I think he was paid like anywhere between 250 to 500 pounds for doing this. And they didn't even invite him to the premiere. He ended up going to see the movie in a general release, expecting his music, I believe, was just going to be used on the title theme.
Oh, wow.
And then it turns up like 65 other times in the movie. Anytime Bond's on the move or any kind of action situation, I believe it was Peter Hunt, the editor, he would just throw it on. And
he's a great editor, by the way. If you want to talk about people behind the scenes who contributed to the success of the series.
Great editor. And when he directed on Her Majesty's Secret Service, a phenomenal director.
Yes.
I feel like one of the great, should I say, disappointments of the Bond series is that On Her Majesty's Secret Service didn't do as well as the Connery Bonds. And while some people considered George Lazenby's role as Bond to be problematic or not at the standard of Connery's or whatever that was, somehow that failure ended up in Peter Hunt's lap, I would imagine, to some degree, and maybe he took the blame for On Her Majesty's Secret Service not being as successful a Bond movie. But I would go as far as to say, other than From Russia with Love, which doesn't have the visceral, insane action scenes of On Her Majesty's Secret Service, On Her Majesty's Secret Service is the best directed Bond movie of that period, all the way until you reach Martin Campbell's Casino Royale.
Well, that's an interesting assessment for sure. I do think it's also a masterpiece on Her Majesty's Secret Service. My own sort of way of looking at the James Bond series is that I love the first 20, the first 14, which end with A View to a Kill, I think are the ones that have the most identifiable James Bond staples to them. Once Ken Adam, John Barry, and a few other people either stop being as instrumental to the series or are not there anymore, to me, what is most recognizable about the James Bond cinematic universe starts to dissipate. But that's just from a completely subjective standpoint on my part. And then when it comes to what is my favorite James Bond film of all time, if I had to pick a single favorite, it would be Goldfinger because I like the tongue-in-cheek flavor of the film, and I think it's the first Bond film to sort of consolidate all of the major James Bond staples. And I would tie it, though, if I didn't have to pick a single favorite, with You Only Live Twice, because for me, that's the most extravagant Bond film in terms of how much thematic content it covers. Everything from nuclear annihilation to swallowing space capsules in outer space to feeding people to piranhas in holodead volcanoes. I just love all that exotic, colorful imagery and thematic content. But
That
like I said, I love the first 20 and
Yeah.
the first 14 in particular. But love is love, so you can't really disappoint me
Yeah.
too much.
Well, your opinion about Goldfinger seems to be the consensus opinion of that being the movie where everything sort of solidified as to the James Bond style and vibe. And that's the first movie where the gadgets, for the most part, were introduced and James Bond became this sort of hyper-real, sort of over the top, but still Goldfinger managed to somehow ground it, whereas other Bond movies lost control of that.
Yes.
And
And there's a
even
consistency to the slickness of that film. So, for example, if you compare Goldfinger to Dr. No, which is the first James Bond film in the official series, the first, let's say, half of the movie doesn't necessarily, even pacing wise, resemble the later James Bond films. I still love it, but it isn't quite the same. It's not as tongue in cheek every step of the way, and it's not as slick. It doesn't move the same way. The pacing isn't the same. I think by the time Goldfinger comes around, there's a certain frenetic pacing, which, to a large extent never was altered until
yeah,
maybe the Daniel Craig films.
I mean, Goldfinger is a very tight Bond film, having just watched it about 2 days ago.
Yes.
I want to wait till we get into our Goldfinger discussion because we're still on Doctor No, but I will just
Yes.
take it back to the fact that even John Barry says that it all came together for the Bond series on Goldfinger. And it was actually the first James Bond movie that John Barry completely controlled the musical soundtrack because he got to write the song for Goldfinger,
That's
which he
right.
hadn't done in From Russia with Love. That was Lionel Bart. And Barry was even using Lionel Bart's theme of From Russia with Love and reorchestrating it. And I actually think From Russia with Love is a very underrated score in the Barry pantheon and doesn't seem to be as discussed as much as some of the others. But just to take it back to Dr. No,
Yes.
Barry saw his music all over the movie and he was pissed off and took his complaints back to, I believe it was Albert Broccoli, Harry Saltzman, or the music minder who put them together. And they said to him, don't worry about it because you're going to compose the Bond movies going forward. So he got the satisfaction of getting to score From Russia with Love. And we'll talk about From Russia with Love, but just to get back to Dr. No, because I read all the novels too. And I remember reading the novel and the character of Honey Rider, who's named Honey Child Rider in the novel. And I always keep thinking they kept that name for the movie, but they didn't. They shortened it. And when she does that classic coming out of the sea moment, that's an iconic James Bond moment. In the novel, she's completely naked, except for the belt strap and the knife.
Yes.
So you could almost imagine if James Bond was being made in the more permissive 70s, would they have gone for that moment as described in the novel? It definitely would have created a different tone to the Bond series. I think it's interesting that the Bond films were considered PG entertainment, but I wonder if they were made in 1968 or 1971, the first Bond movie came out, if they would have been
It's a good question.
more overtly erotic in following Fleming's novel. And also, since Dr. No is the first Bond novel filmed, so you can say this of the movie, this is where they started with the Bond double entendre names for the women. So
Yes,
obviously Honey Rider has a sexual innuendo to it as
for
well.
sure.
And not to quickly loop all the way back to the more recent Bonds, but they did away with that, the double entendre names, which was, I thought, amazingly fun. Maybe women of today find it insulting, but then you don't do the buy into James Bond period. But that was always the fun of it. And
Well, puns are the highest form of literature, according to James Joyce and Alfred Hitchcock.
well, I can see that. And even I mean, come on, I think the two most in your face double entendre Bond women names is obviously Pussy Galore, and then
Who's
people
my favorite
forget
Bond girl? That's just me speaking personally.
and I adore Hannah Blackman in the role. I think she's a goddess. She's
And she
insane.
played a goddess in Jason the Argonauts, by the way.
Well, and I think the reason she got cast was her role on The Avengers. As she herself said in an interview, she doesn't think the Bond producers could have gone with anybody else because she checked all the boxes for Pussy Galore. She had the judo and the martial arts fighting background, and the judo was so much a part of the Pussy Galore persona for the pivotal scene, which ends up being the love scene.
Yes.
And obviously, she was looking amazingly beautiful and statuesque and all of that. You know, I also find this interesting. I think in the novel, she's American, isn't she? And in the film, She always feels American to me in the film Pussy Galore, although they don't define her as being, and obviously Hannah Blackman was English.
Yes.
They don't define her as being British or American, but she definitely feels she has this toughness of an American woman in the film.
Oh, definitely. She
But
actually reminds me of, in the film at least, she reminds me of a British Lauren Bacall because they're both very poised.
yeah, very much a
Um,
Lauren Bacall
yeah,
feeling to
and
her.
also probably more mature than their actual age. You know, because Lauren Bacall, when she was with Humphrey Bogart in their movies together, depending on which movie we're talking about, she's either 19 or early 20s. So she came across as much older and much more
Well,
sophisticated than her
well, I
age.
think Hannah Blackman was one of the older Bond women in the films because she was, I want to say she was like 36 and when they made Goldfinger, something like that. We have to check on that. But I remember reading that stat somewhere recently. She was definitely
Well, either
mid,
way, she's very poised, and I just appreciate that. I think she's just a great
yeah.
overall
And what it
Bond
was,
girl presence.
so what I was going to say is you have the name Pussy Glow, but we also forget one of probably the other Bond woman names that would be so offensive to people is Holly Goodhead
Hmm.
from Moonraker, which is astounding. You know, when you think about that for PG films, they went with these names. But what I love about Pussy Galore is that Hannah Blackman was so in on the joke. And she, when they started doing the marketing, the set visits and started doing the press for Goldfinger, the journalists were avoiding calling her character Pussy or Pussy Galore. And Hannah Blackman would always like interject and go, "Oh, you mean pussy?" And she was having a lot of fun with it. And she thought these journalists, and specifically on the American side, they all had to stick up their ass about it. And she fully owned Pussy Galore, and she was cool with it.
And
It
isn't it
wasn't like,
funny that at the time in the 60s, the James Bond films were a force of progressive thought, and today many so-called progressives will say that the movies are reactionary. So it just goes to show you how standards change and maybe individual minds are not calibrating things properly. But at the time, James Bond, specifically the James Bond films, were seen as sexually liberating, which is why the sexual playfulness I think is very important. And
yeah. And
actually, I think it's timeless. I think that the old James Bond movies, specifically from the 60s and 70s, remind us not to take sex and sexuality too seriously, that we should have fun
exactly,
with these things.
exactly. And it's very sad that people who look at those Bond movies through today's lens of this sort of combative sexual stance that we take today and these huge debates about consent and all this stuff. Those movies were about men and women being very much flirtatious with each other and into each other. And while James Bond tended to, I guess, have a high opinion of his power to seduce women, it seemed very receptive on the women's side in terms of the buy-in to the James Bond universe. I don't think you should be going to a James Bond movie or reading a James Bond book if you can't make that buy-in that this is fantasy.
It is.
Fantasy from the point of view of every man wishing he had the sexual prowess of James Bond, and the women, the fantasy of meeting somebody who checked all the boxes of James Bond, from the
Correct.
attractiveness to being powerful and can handle himself and elegant. And, you know, James
And
Bond,
can save the world. Even the idea that an individual can save the world is an affront to today's emphasis on everybody being mediocre. So James Bond is something to aspire to,
he
right? It would be
wasn't
great
just,
if
not
individuals
even,
can save the world.
he wasn't just somebody who could save the world. He was highly educated.
Yes.
He was an expert in almost every subject, including walking into M's house and being able to quote lepidoptery or whatever it is about,
Yes.
you know, butterflies or diamonds in South Africa,
That's
or
right.
anytime,
And he
you
knows
know,
how
they
to fix
call.
drinks.
Yes, but anytime he's called into M's office and they bring up a new energy source or they're
Yeah.
discussing, he's already an expert on it.
That's right. Or even in the movie Diamonds Are Forever, when they're having a discussion about different liquor, he knows exactly the right vintage.
I
And
love that scene
yeah, it's great. See, that's a
where he
scene that
there.
you won't see in the Daniel Craig Bond films.
Yeah, where Bond he's having dinner. I don't know if it's at
It's a briefing. They're doing a briefing.
but it's at the location of the host of that is the Diamond Consortium expert, because
Correct.
he's the first one to criticize the drink, the port or whatever it was, brandy or something, and saying it was a mediocre year. And then Bond gives him the exact year and why it is mediocre. And M is like sitting back there going, "What are you guys talking about? It seems perfectly fine to me."
Yeah.
I mean, there's no doubt that James Bond is a superhero.
That's right.
But he's not a superhero that has the ability to fly.
Well, sometimes he can fly depending on what's attached to his back.
Yeah. But he's certainly, Bond can be killed. He can take a bullet. And it's weird because I will always talk about my favorite period of Bond being the early 60s into, let's say, Dr. No, the Man with the Golden Gun. But then in Casino Royale, I think Martin Campbell and the producer was so smart in bringing back that sensibility. So Daniel Craig definitely, while he feels formidable and a guy could break your neck, he does feel also somebody who could definitely take a bullet. And even the ending after, Vesper dies, the pain that he projects is every bit as like shattering as George Lazenby looking up from Diana Rigg's dead body in On Her Majesty's Secret Service. The movies are grounded in tragedy and real consequences that so many of the other Bond movies didn't have. But just to get back to Dr. No, before we dive into From Russia with Love, there's a couple of things.
Yes.
So you're also seeing the sort of start of Bond as this forward kind of sexual animal, a seducer, and the Chinese woman who works for the geologist, I forget his name, but she sets up Bond to die. And when Bond evades the assassins on the mountainside road and he turns up at her house up in the hills, she's shocked to see him because she's still in the towel.
Yes.
But then you see Bond getting very handsy with her. And, at first she's kind of pushing him away. But then, of course, it's a weird situation because she also is trying to keep Bond there because she wants to get his guard down and so she can make a call and have the assassins come. So in that case, while Bond is seducing her, she's sort of on the job. So that sequence never feels that sexy to me because I feel she doesn't have the buy-in on James Bond. She may find him an attractive man, but she's definitely sleeping with Bond as part of like survival and entrapment. But even while Connery as Bond is in control of that situation because he understands who she is and that she's working for Dr. No, and he knows that he's going to end up having her arrested, he's not above sleeping with her. And right from the start, there's this, Bond uses sex as a weapon, but also to his own self-satisfaction.
And it's also a tongue-in-cheek situation because just like the novels, I would argue, there has always been various types of tongue-in-cheek humor at play. And by the way, it's important to note that Dr. No, the novel, is quite outlandish in the best possible way, in my opinion. For example, Dr. No in the novel keeps a pet giant squid in a tank, and he also has an obstacle course with other deadly animals, including tarantulas. Yeah. So this is not a strictly realistic universe that Ian Fleming has created.
And speaking of tarantulas, there is one thing I'm offended by in Dr. No, and that's the tarantula scene, because they take this innocent tarantula and they put him in the bed with Bond, and then the tarantula is crawling up Bond, and he walks up Bond's face, and then the tarantula's off Bond's face. He's on the pillow. And the first thing Bond does is he jumps up and he gets his shoe and he pounds the poor fucking innocent tarantula to death.
How do you know the tarantula was innocent?
Just fucking get a box, Bond, and put the tarantula in the box.
How do you know that tarantula was innocent, though? There was no trial.
Well, yeah. And are tarantulas even poisonous in the first place? I guess there must be some...
well, that's the other thing. Both in the books and the movies, strict realism is not adhered to. So the fact that something looks exotic is enough for it although in the books, Ian Fleming knew so much about fauna and flora, and we talked about this before, if Bond's swimming in the sea to get to an island,
Fleming is described, by the time Bond reaches the shore, he's described every fish in the water that
That's
he's
correct,
encountered.
but at the same time, he does indulge in flights of fancy. So for again, the giant squid used as a an anthropomorphic monster in some cases, and acting in a way that it wouldn't in real life is just the fun aspect of the fantasy, which is why I've always thought that an inspiration for the James Bond novels, and then by extension the original Bond films, were the Tarzan novels by Edgar Rice Burroughs, because they both share this sort of larger than life exoticism. And in both cases, the protagonist can save the world, which is sort of the fantasy of the everyday schlub who wishes that he could be more than he is. You know, if he's cooped up in a bank doing bureaucratic work, maybe he's daydreaming about saving the world and having interesting sexcapades and whatever else. So, in that sense, both the Tarzan novels and the James Bond novels and short stories were very liberating. And I would argue again that the James Bond films, specifically of the 60s, 70s, well, actually, I would say for the duration of the 20th century, were liberating in more ways than one.
Well, both James Bond and Tarzan were virile, very attractive
That's also true.
characters that presented as almost not a supernatural ability well, in Tarzan's case, it is a little bit supernatural, his ability to connect
Communicate with
animals.
animals, yeah.
And then in Octopussy, there is a tip of the hat to Tarzan in that moment. It's not a beloved moment because it's so over the top, where Bond is swinging across some part of the jungle or something and doing the Tarzan call. And I don't think a high point of the Bond series by any means.
But it is
But
clever
again,
if you know your literature and you know your movies, it actually makes a lot more sense than if you just watch that movie without knowing what it's referencing, right?
but it
So,
also plays very goofy in a situation where you want Bond to actually feel like people are after you and trying to kill you. And whereas I don't believe Connery ever made fun of the physical fighting until he had subdued the villain. And Connery would be like walking out the door and make some comment, one liner.
yes.
Whereas the Roger Moore movies infuse that into the middle of the fight scenes, or
Yes,
those
certainly
sequences.
more so than was the case in the Connery Bonds for sure.
And I wanted to also talk about the scene. I think it was Professor Dent, the guy who works for Dr. No, the geologist.
Yes.
But there's a really brutal sequence in Dr. No when he comes in to kill Bond, and Bond's put the pillows in the bed, and he shoots the pillows, and then Bond basically shoots him. Bond's put a silencer on his Walther PPK before he's arrived. So Bond shoots him, and then Bond shoots him in the back again. It's a really brutal killing
Yes.
for a movie of that period. And we tend to think of Bond as very lighthearted. But when you look back at Dr. No, Bond is a ruthless killer in that film, as he was depicted in the novels. Connery's portrayal of Bond is very authentic to the tone of the novels in Dr. No.
That's true, but I would still argue that there was always a tongue-in-cheek aspect to, and some novels are more tongue-in-cheek than others, don't get me
I
wrong.
don't think the one-liners, and I'm escaping an example of these pithy asides that Bond that, and it started with the Connery films, even in Doctor No. They were not part of the Fleming novels, to the best of my knowledge.
No, but you had different forms of tongue-in-cheek humor. Even just the sexual scenes in the novels and the short stories, or the seduction scenes are playful, right? When he's flirting with a girl or trying to seduce the girl or being seduced by a girl, there's a playfulness, a tongue-in-cheek playfulness. Not to mention some of the villains, including Doctor No, if we're talking about the novel Doctor No, the way that they express themselves is sort of tongue-in-cheek in a subtle way, the same way that, let's say, James Mason's character in North by Northwest is tongue-in-cheek, right? He's full of himself, and he sort of takes pleasure in the fact that he's full of himself, which is another thing to consider when we're discussing the James Bond films or the books. You could argue that James Bond, the character, and the James Bond villains are all Nietzschean supermen, but James Bond is the more positive outcome to being a Nietzschean Superman, whereas the villains are failures because they ultimately can't live up to their own high standards. They become megalomaniacal monsters. They think they can break all the rules, but they aren't powerful enough or smart enough or wise enough to do so. So in that regard, James Bond villains are also like Captain Nemo and Jules Verne's
Oh
20,000
yeah,
Leagues Under the Sea, on
I
and
mean, the
on.
villains, there was definitely a Fleming staple of creating these larger than life villains who essentially, most of them were insane,
Hmm.
but they didn't feel like cartoon characters. The later movies maybe pushed them more in that direction, but Doctor No doesn't feel like a cartoon character.
No,
And
Doctor No is more
yeah,
grounded compared to, for example, Moonraker.
I mean,
But
I think the over the top villains started with Goldfinger, and he is again. I mean, he's the iconic Bond villain,
yes.
and he walks the line between over the top and being grounded, but he's not so crazy that he isn't constantly analyzing the situation, which is one of the reasons why he doesn't kill Bond when he feels Bond has something to contribute to him, information, and also creating the impression that everything is okay because he understands that Bond is being surveilled by the CIA. But even Bond says it in the movie to Pussy Galore at one point, Goldfinger's completely out of his mind or he's
Yeah,
mad.
he does say that.
I mean, they don't get any more insane than like Hugo Drax in Moonraker, who wants to literally take out the planet and start a new race in space. I mean, that would be like, when you think
There are
about it, it's the
people in
most,
real life today who are trying to do that.
I
So
know, but it's the most preposterous
yeah,
plot
but
device of
give
all time.
humanity
Like,
enough time and eventually it will catch up to Moonraker. You'll see.
well,
You'll see
no, I
one
mean,
day
Elon Musk is Hugo Drax. I
any
mean,
number of people. There are many people who you could liken to Hugo Drax.
but Elon Musk has his own fucking space program corporation. He's got his own rockets. He literally is Hugo Drax. He wants to go and create a community on Mars, and we're all wishing he would just go already. But we're getting ahead of
So now we
ourselves.
should segue into the most serious of
Well,
the Bond
wait.
films.
I
Oh,
had
okay.
something else to say about Doctor No. It's the introduction of Sylvia Trent, who is the first Bond woman that you meet in the series because she's in the casino playing against Bond. What are they playing? Baccarat, or I try to even remember. And she's beautiful and she's very sexually forward. And this starts right in Doctor No, where
Yes.
the women let it be known to James Bond that they want him. They play a little coy for the first few seconds, and then by the time Bond leaves the casino, and we've seen this in so many of the Bond movies, including on Her Majesty's Secret Service, they turn up in his room. They're kind of throwing themselves at him, which people today may think that's not a real female behavior. But again, it's the buy-in to the fantasy. James Bond is a male-female fantasy, maybe a little loaded towards the male point of view, but it's definitely women can fantasize about a James Bond figure in their life. And the sex is very sanitized, so it's not even offensive in that way. They don't have to have a pornographic fantasy of Bond.
No.
It's just the overall image of Bond, the brilliant man, the protector, the savior of the world, as you said. And then Sylvia Trent, to transition to From Russia with Love, turns up in From Russia with Love again. And she's like Connery's Bond's ongoing fling, the golf playing Sylvia Trent, I should add. And so that's a transition to From Russia with Love,
That
which
actually is a better transition than what I
which
was trying to do.
I have so much to say about From Russia with Love because I adore this movie so much. I have watched From Russia with Love maybe 50 times. It never gets old. It never feels outlandish in a way that letter bombs do, where they sort of lose you with the reality. From Russia with Love is a classic spy film. It's an espionage film. It feels like, to me, it's the real DNA of James Bond in terms of what Bond does as a spy, and Bond in exotic locations, and Bond coming up against Spectre. I believe Dr. No is described as being a member of Spectre.
He is.
But From Russia with Love is really where you start to feel Spectre. It's the introduction on screen of Blofeld, even though you never see his face.
Sometimes referred to as number one, depending on the
Right.
context.
Do they even mention his name as Blofeld in? I don't think they do
I
in
don't
From
think
Russia
they
with Love.
do. I think they just refer to him as number one, but we know because we've seen the entire series that he's also Blofeld. So, yeah, number one
Right.
is Blofeld.
And I love the flow of From Russia with Love. It just moves so beautifully. The plot, I think it's a great plot. I think it may be my favorite Bond plot. It couldn't exist without this image of James Bond of who we have, because the whole Spectre plot is designed around the fact that this woman who works in the Russian consulate in Turkey is going to look at a photograph of James Bond. This is the plan that they have. Fall in love with him, throw herself at him, and offer him the Lecter code breaking machine that they have.
Yeah, the decoding machine, yeah.
Yeah, and everybody knows it's a trap going in, but everybody, like the British and, I mean, Russia is sort of used as a pawn in this film. I think in the novel, it really was Russia. It was...
And as you can see, Russia has improved a lot since this time. No, I'm joking.
No, Russia's gone down.
Yeah, so exactly. The film is actually more relevant today than it was actually for, let's say, a decade in the 1990s when actually Russia was doing better. But
and Russia used to be the villains, or they used to be integral to all the Bond plots, including even up until Spy Who Loved Me and For Your Eyes Only, actually. And then everybody goes, well, Russia's not the bad guy anymore, so we've got to come up with these other maniacal characters similar to like Goldfinger. And now, if I was writing James Bond today, I would be back at Russia.
Of course. But the thing is, I've often joked that the plot of Octopussy is basically what, a part of it at least, is what Putin did to consolidate power. But so it's actually one of the most prophetic movies ever made, just like Tomorrow Never Dies in its own way, because it's about a villain, creating
Rupert
fake news.
Murdoch.
Yeah, exactly. And many other people could fit that description. But that's another thing we should talk about at some other point, how prophetic the James Bond movies are. They've predicted countless geopolitical matters. In fact, I don't know if there's any other film series that can equal the number of accurate predictions that the James Bond films are responsible for. But
I'm waiting for the invisible car.
That will come, don't worry.
So I just wanted to go back to we're in from Russia, but I wanted to talk, because since we're talking about the plot.
Yes.
And Tanya is the lead Bond girl from Russia 11. She is the Russian consulate worker who's going to track Bond. Now, Daniela Bianchi, who plays Tanya, I think is the most beautiful actress to play any Bond woman in the series. I think she is beyond stunning. I think she's elegant.
She's still alive, by the way.
Is she?
Yeah.
That's great. Every time that I watch From Russia with Love, I'm so taken aback about how beautiful she is. She was dubbed in the role, and that was same with Ursula Andress. It wasn't until Hannah Blackman that you actually hear an actual Bond woman's voice, but still, and she's beautifully dubbed, actually. She is magnificent and completely believable why Sean Connery, as Bond, falls for her and is eager to proceed with the mission, so to speak. And when she turns up in his bed for the first time, I think it's the fastest James Bond goes from not knowing a Bond woman to actually sleeping with him. I mean, it literally happens within 30 seconds that they're consummating this relationship, even though the whole setup of the plot mechanism is that she's in love with Bond. And what's interesting also about the first time she appears in Bond's bed, From Russia with Love actually has a nude scene. Now, it's not Daniela Bianchi, it's a body double doing it. But there is nudity in From Russia with Love going all the way back to, 1963?
Yes.
And
it was released in 63, yeah.
Yeah, you see her crossing the room and getting to the bed. And I had forgotten about that. And when you start to watch these movies on 4K, as I've been watching the first Connery 6, the clarity of them is so stunning. And you're seeing things in these movies that theatrical audiences and home video VHS and even to DVD never saw. In Diamonds Are Forever, in the pre-credit scene, when Bond approaches the woman on the beach looking for Blofeld and yanks her bikini straps around her neck, you see nudity there too, which was never previously visible to my eye. And I don't know whether they cut the single frames out in previous Bond versions, but...
Well, because he removes her bra very quickly, so...
But you can literally see her nipples.
Well, I haven't seen the 4K version yet.
Yeah, and I'd never seen that before. So I'm wondering whether when they were in post on that, did a single frame cut out or two frames out of that, because it works in almost like a jump cut. And I don't mean to be perving of this. I just mean to be forensically stating that the nudity in the Bond films, which we don't really think of as much, has been there as a staple in the Bond movies. And in the title sequences in 4K now, you're seeing so much more as well.
That's
Um,
true, but I mean, I think most people, even if they weren't aware of like how much new there was, especially in the title sequences, they knew it was there. You know, like
but you're
like the.
seeing, but
No,
I
I
mean,
know what
there's
you
a,
mean, though. Of course.
yeah, I mean, the clarity of which I don't think was ever meant to be seen this clear, you're actually seeing now.
Yes,
The Bond movies were never as like nudity chased as people necessarily think. And From Russia with Love is a very sexy Bond film.
it
You know,
is.
Karen Bay.
It lives up to its title.
Yeah, exactly. Karen Bay has these women. Every time you see him, he's with a different woman, seducing a different woman, played by the wonderful Pedro Armendáriz. And I'm sure you know this. It was a very tragic story.
Yes.
I love this character and I love this actor. And midway or even early into the production, he was starting to appear very sickly. And I think Pedro Armendáriz knew there was something really seriously wrong with him. And Terence Young sent him to his doctor in London, who was also like the Queen's doctor or something. And they diagnosed him with like late stage cancer.
Yes.
And they didn't think he had much longer to live. And Pedro Armendáriz was like, I've got to finish this movie, please. They changed their entire shooting schedule to shoot him out, including going to Pinewood Studios earlier than they intended. And a man is literally dying on screen while you're seeing him there, even though he's giving this great jovial performance as Karen Bay. And there are apparently times where they had to stand him up in frame just to get the shots. I think he died. I mean, they might have even been midway or three-quarters of the way through the shoot when his story gets even more horrific because he goes to a hospital in, I think it's in Los Angeles, and they've got him on like pain medications, and it's the end. And he doesn't want to die like that. And he smuggles like a shotgun or a rifle into the hospital and kills himself in the hospital.
Terrible.
It's terrible. And that really put such a pale over the entire production of From Russia with Love.
It was also the last film that JFK watched before he was assassinated.
Wow.
Which is
And
very
specifically
strange.
also because JFK put From Russia with Love on the map because the novel was on his reading list.
Yes.
And that did more for
And of
the
course, he had a lot in
popularity.
common with James Bond.
Yes, with the women, that's for sure. And then, again, From Russia with Love has that sort of virile sexuality of the Connery Bond, where again, there's a little pat on the butt with Daniela Bianchi on the train, but it's out of love, and they're already in a relationship. So anybody who feels, and they look at that scene and go, "What's with Sean Connery and the butt slaps or whatever it is?" The man's already slept with this woman many times in the movie. It definitely doesn't pass today as a public display of affection that anyone's going to approve of.
No, but I will also say that if it was the opposite, if a man got slapped by a woman
It
on his
wouldn't even cause a
behind, yeah,
blink
of
of an
course.
eye.
No,
Yeah,
that's right. And it does. I've seen
yeah.
it in shows and stuff like that, modern shows. But the other thing I'll say is you've even got this lesbian stuff between Rosa Klebb, one of the villains in the movie at
Oh,
least,
yeah, yeah.
and your favorite Bond girl, because she's like caressing her and,
And it's
giving her
very,
look.
I was looking at it, it's very subtle, but very overtly done in the film. There is no denying that Lotte Lenya, as Rosa Klebb, is playing a lesbian. And I can see why that is deemed a little bit offensive today because she's a lesbian. She's a very unattractive lesbian in the role, although Lotte Lenya, when she was younger, was not that unattractive. And she's very much molesting her almost in a subtle way. She's leering over her, and it's a very unsavory portrait of a lesbian.
It's true, but she is a villain, don't forget. So it's like, of course, she's going to be, someone who behaves badly.
Which makes it even more problematic because then you associate lesbian and villain together, and unattractive lesbian. It is the character, and I accept it for what it is. I would hope gay, sexually fluid people would look back at it and go, it is a character, but
Well, then what do you say about the
But I'll
straight
say
villains? But
this.
then what do you say about the straight villains?
Well,
See what I mean? Like,
that
it doesn't make that argument to me
but it
seems
doesn't
very
stand out as much because the villains are all straight. But I will say
well, except for in
that
Diamonds
if
Are
anybody
Forever.
had a problem with unattractive lesbians, they make up for it in Goldfinger with one of the most beautiful lesbians ever put on screen. And then they completely destroy it by having James Bond converted to heterosexuality.
Although in both these movies, the lesbians in question are so subtly presented as lesbians that you could even not realize that they're lesbians,
But
right? I mean, it depends who it is.
I will contend that it's not subtle in Goldfinger, and it's not subtle at all in the book.
No, not in the book.
But there are lines in Goldfinger that are very overt when Bond is trying to seduce Pussy Galore, and she says stuff like, "I'm immune to your charms." And she has a couple of other lines that very much make it clear that she's not into men until Bond comes into her life. And this really goes back to Ian Fleming because Ian Fleming actually did believe that homosexuality was aberrant behavior. And there's a published letter that Ian Fleming wrote to somebody that came out in a book a couple years ago. And I read an article about it in The Guardian, where he wrote that Pussy Galore was waiting for the right man to come along and cure her psychopathological malady.
Well, that's sort of expressed in the novel as well to some extent. I mean, it's not maybe as overt, but it's sort of there.
Yes. I mean, if there is, by today's standards, the most offensive criticism on a Bond movie out of all the James Bond movies, specifically the early Bond movies, I think it's this point that would offend people the most today, is that James Bond is such a virile man that he can turn a gay woman straight. But in defense of the storyline, I would look at Pussy Galore as somebody who is sexually fluid. I would look at Pussy Galore as someone who is potentially bisexual. And I know that may be diluting the fact that she is just gay, and why should we have to change lesbians to bisexuality? But the entire plot hinges on the idea that Bond can basically,
But that's
I don't want to
also,
use
I would
the
argue
word
that
convert,
her
but
conversion,
seduce
yeah.
Pussy Galore into falling in love with him and altering Goldfinger's plans by alerting the CIA and having the poison gas substituted with just knockout gas or no gas whatsoever.
Yes, but I would argue that in the movie's defense, it is part of its sexual playfulness that any of that stuff that you just described is taking place at all. So, for example, the idea that James Bond is so attractive that even a lesbian would be interested in him is sort of a joke. And then the other thing I would say is one of the screenwriters was gay who wrote Goldfinger, Paul Dane, who's Jewish too, by the way. And we should also one day maybe talk about, or even in this podcast, talk about the Jewish contributions to the James Bond films, which includes Richard Maybaum, who wrote so many of the films or
Wow,
co-wrote
I
so many
was
of
not
them.
aware that now that I hear the name. But yeah, Richard Maybaum was just a power figure. I mean,
And
the
Ken
best.
Adam, the production designer.
Oh, really?
And
Wow.
Harry Saltzman. Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
Before you know
Well,
it,
Harry
you realize that
Saltzman, I think, is a negative check in the column, personally, but because he was a prick. Nothing against about the Jewishness, but Harry Saltzman, he was the guy who'd always like step in and like criticize John Barry's great title songs and say, "Oh, we can't do Goldfinger. What is that song about? It's overly sexual." And then Diamonds Off Heavy almost had a heart attack with the lyrics. And in general, Harry Saltzman did not have a good reputation as a Bond producer. And Albert Broccoli was the mensch, generally the most beloved producer and generally the one who sided with the better instincts of the top Bond contributors. Whereas if it was left to Harry Saltzman's own devices, I'm not sure the James Bond series would be as we know it today. But it was interesting because they were both a moderating factor on each other. And I say that because The Man with the Golden Gun was the last Bond movie that Harry Saltzman produced. And I do not think they got better from that point on until Casino Royale.
well, by the
So
way, from what I've read, some of Harry Saltzman's contributions were creative. I mean, I agree with you that sometimes he was wrong, but sometimes you're wrong, sometimes you're not. So it really just depends on like what specifically he was bringing to the table at any given point. Because like I read, for example, that he had actually insisted on making the movies darker at times, which is interesting. But I just give anyone credit who's able to bring movies into existence, especially on a consistent basis. But yeah, your point is taken for sure. And
I mean, they were
obviously,
definitely a unique pair as producers because whatever the chemistry between them, it brought James Bond on screen to life.
correct.
They both had a sign off on Sean Connery as Bond, which
That's right.
showed. I don't know if anybody has described the situation in the casting room or a fly on the wall as to how the conversation went with agreeing to go with Sean Connery, but Sean Connery was definitely not the first choice for James Bond. They went through a bunch of
That's
names.
right.
But arriving at Sean Connery, and whether it was that Saltzman or Broccoli relented to the casting of that, is still a positive because they went with the best actor for the role.
And also, I will just say one other thing in defense of Harry Saltzman. It was him who he secured the option for the novel, or I should say was it for the novel or I can't remember what exactly he optioned. But the point is, if it wasn't that initial option, then there wouldn't be any James Bond movies as we know it.
You know, and
Um,
speaking about Saltzman and Broccoli, now Harry Saltzman, he was Canadian, wasn't he?
yes,
And Albert Broccoli was American.
that's right.
And people seem to think of the series, well, it was created by a British author, Ian Fleming. The movies were American productions. The movies were produced by Americans.
That's
And
right.
even though they kept the flavor of Bond to be very British, they're as much American films as they can be considered British films. And I don't think it's until Goldfinger that Bond even steps on American geography.
And in terms of their actual energy level, they certainly feel like American films. But just going back to Harry Saltzman for 1 second, I just wanted to confirm this, and I did. I looked it up. It was Harry Saltzman who, in 1960, optioned the James Bond novels, excluding Casino Royale. So if he hadn't done that, you could argue that there wouldn't be a James Bond series as we know it, because that was the initial crucial first step. Like, if so in other words, he found Albert R. Broccoli and then teamed up with him. So
I
Broccoli
think the
might never have
story is
been.
that Broccoli was chasing the rights too. And if you say that Harry Saltzman got them first, somehow Albert L. Broccoli was able to convince him to let him in on the deal. And I think that ameliorated the risk for Saltzman moving forward. Or you know what it was? It was Albert Broccoli had the relationship, I believe, with United Artists.
No, that's correct, exactly. But what all I'm saying is, without Harry Saltzman, you could argue there wouldn't have been any James Bond movies because he made the
Yes,
first crucial step.
I can see that that was an important producing relationship. I'm
Yes.
just repeating conversations that come from John Barry
Oh, okay.
and conversations that have been quoted from other people that Harry Saltzman sometimes was his own worst enemy, interceding or making silly decisions or interfering in the edit or stuff like that,
Yes.
where Albert Broccoli had to step in and put the creative responsibility back in the filmmakers as opposed to Saltzman. And also, Saltzman was not tactful at all in his approach. He was very brash, whereas Broccoli was quite a charming, very congenial man.
Yes.
Yeah, that's neither here nor there. And so going back to Goldfinger, you can't also not discuss the iconic gold painted Shirley Eaton image, which was hugely fetishized image of this naked woman painted gold, which I think is maybe the most iconic James Bond image of the entire series as
For
far as
sure. And not
women
only
go.
that, I think it's one of the greatest surreal images in film history. And what's
And,
interesting is
and
you could
it's
argue
such
just.
a yeah,
Oh,
go
go
ahead.
on.
No, I just think it's such an amazing villain's revenge on Bond. And like Bond steals his girlfriend, even though she claims not to have slept with Goldfinger. But Goldfinger is so outraged that he murders her. But not only that, he puts his mark on her to show Bond that this was my property. And even in death, she remains my property. And she's painted gold. And I don't know how the character Bond doesn't turn the rest of Goldfinger into a revenge mission for going after Goldfinger for that barbaric act of what he does to her. It's one of the most savage murders, if not the most savage murder in the entire Bond series, because he literally defiles the corpse.
Correct. And also, it's satirical commentary on Goldfinger's megalomaniacal impulses. which is
Yeah,
why, for example, John Barry comes up with this glittery sound in the music, which is quite
very
extraordinary.
metallic, a
Yeah,
metallic
exactly.
like clinging cue. Yeah,
Correct. And it has a playful tongue-in-cheek quality to it. It's not just purely sinister. And that of course ties back to the theme song, which is my favorite James Bond theme song. I love so many of them, but that's my favorite if I had to pick one. And the title sequence itself, if you want to talk about gold painted women, is it's not just a satirical masterpiece, it's also a surreal masterpiece. Because the song itself is tongue in cheek in the sense that it's mocking Goldfinger's sadism, right? In other words,
yeah.
the lyrics, like, it's playful about his seductive qualities and the dangers that it poses to people. So it's a very sophisticated song. It's a very sophisticated title sequence, and just aesthetically, it's beautiful. I love the fact that, for example, a gold hand comes into frame suddenly. That's the first thing you see when the title sequence begins. It's just such a bold, surreal statement, and
And
really,
the song is just
it
phenomenal.
is thunderous.
The John Barry composition and Shirley Bassey, who went on to sing two other James Bond titled songs, Diamonds Are Forever, which is my favorite, and Moonraker. But she was also supposed to sing Thunderball, and they changed. I think she even recorded Thunderball, and then they went in a different direction with Tom Jones, and she was very pissed off. But anyway, I don't know if you've ever heard the story with John Barry was very good friends with Michael Caine. And Michael Caine, I think he had broken up a relationship and he didn't have a place to stay. So he was staying at John Barry's flat in London. And Barry was composing Goldfinger and he was up all night. And Michael Caine couldn't sleep because he kept hearing John Barry like composing the song Goldfinger on the piano. And in the morning, I believe Barry said, "Hey, let me play this for you. I just composed this Goldfinger." So Michael Caine, one of his many claims to fame is he was the first person to ever hear the song Goldfinger.
That's cool. That's
And
really
it's
cool.
yeah, and it's such a great soundtrack. It's such a great score. It's so brassy and fun and propulsive. It was a gold record hit. It musically defines the series, even though I'll contend that From Russia with Love is a very underrated score, as I said
It's a
before.
great score too, for sure.
From Russia Love, also the cues on the Orient Express, they're so like thunderous and dramatic. And then the Lionel Bart originated love theme is so sweeping and emotional. And the music is so exotic to From Russia with Love. It's amazing how Barry can just jump from Turkey into Goldfinger, which is a very American sound because it starts out in Miami.
Yes,
And even though it goes back to Switzerland, it ends up in Kentucky. And so the music, even when I first arrived in Kentucky, has kind of like this bluegrass feel to it. And then the attack on Fort Knox, the music is like it's some of the best
astonishing.
acting.
It is.
Yeah, yeah,
Every step of the way is punctuated. That's what I love about old style film composers, generally speaking. They did what I consider to be comprehensive scores. So almost every moment of the film is scored in some
yeah.
way.
And
And
and with leitmotifs for the
yes,
characters. So when Goldfinger first appears on screen, you hear the little Goldfinger riff,
that's right.
which is not on the official soundtrack album, which is unfortunate.
And the other
Uh,
thing I wanted to say is Goldfinger is the film that basically makes the James Bond film template tongue in cheek to a degree that we hadn't seen before. And when we talk about the song itself, just look at some of the lyrics here. Such a cold finger beckons you to enter his web of sin, but don't go in, right? It's this playful quality that mocks the villains.
was that Anthony Newley's lyric?
He co-wrote the song, correct?
Yeah, who was
Um,
the other Isley
Brickus,
Briskus?
yeah, who
Brickis,
also
yeah.
did You Only Live Twice, which is also a masterpiece in my opinion.
It's a great. I
Um,
love that score. I wish I loved the movie more than this, but we'll discuss that when we get to it.
Yes, we will. But so, yeah, I just wanted to make mention of the fact that the tongue-in-cheek nature of Goldfinger was sort of unprecedented, not just for the series, but in film history up to that point, because it was a new form of highly sexualized tongue-in-cheek surrealism. There really wasn't anything quite like it before. It's interesting because as much as I love Luis Buñuel, I think that the first 2 decades of James Bond produced images that were actually more imaginative than anything in his films, and he made many masterpieces, like Belle de Jour, for example. Just the one image of the gold painted dead woman is I think, more imaginative and more outre, more startling than anything in any Luis Buñuel film. But I'm speaking personally, obviously it's subjective.
No,
Um,
I think it's beautifully surreal. And then you add to that Ken Adams' amazing sets, which again, I think,
yes,
while hinted at in Doctor No with the underwater layer, with the aquarium and some of the other sets, it really comes into itself with this incredible set of Fort Knox. They literally built a Fort Knox set because there's very few people that ever been inside Fort Knox, and they couldn't get a
that's right.
single person to describe what it looked like. So Ken Adam just used his imagination on designing this phenomenal multi-level set with an elevator and all the gold bars stacked. And after the movie came out, he got a letter from the woman who ran Fort Knox, and she complimented Ken Adam on his imagination. I'm trying to interpret whether she thought he was accurate or outlandish. But either way, she seemed to get a thrill out of that. But the set is fantastic, as is Goldfinger's romper room where he
Where he
gasses the
gasses
villain.
them to death. Yeah, what a great tongue-in-cheek. Well, that's the thing, you see. Ken Adam is partly responsible for the tongue-in-cheek surrealism of the Bond films. And that's a very good small example of it, right? The
When
rec room turns into a death trap.
when you look at the DNA of James Bond, the two people, and I'm talking about visualizing Bond, not the screenplays and Richard Maybaum,
Yes,
but the DNA of the sight and sound of James Bond, if you pull out John Barry and Ken Adam, you have a completely different thing. It would,
definitely.
I mean, they were so essential to establishing the Bondiness of it. Now, Ted Moore shot most of those early Bond movies and even continued all the way up until The Man with the Golden Gun, even though he didn't shoot on Her Majesty's Secret Service. And I don't know if there was maybe one other he didn't shoot, but I don't know if the cinematography itself, while very effective, I think you could have brought in another cinematographer and still having the Ken
Well,
Adams
you know
sets.
that's a fact because Freddie Young did You Only Live Twice and it looks great too.
Right.
So,
And then on Her Majesty's Secret Service, Michael Reed. And Peter Hunt directed him to shoot it in a very realistic, grittier flavor, which is sort of where the Daniel Craig Bond movies went. But it has a very different feel. The Blofeld's Piers Gloria is a fun, cool set in itself. It does lack the Ken Adamness of the rest of the Bond movies, the outlandishness of it, even though I love everything about On Her Majesty's Secret Service. In a way, in some places, Blofeld's Piers Gloria layer does take a little bit from the Ken Adams, but it isn't, Ken Adams sets, they always had the magnificent skylights and the metallic sheen to them and the modern furniture. And you don't get that feel at all in On Her Majesty's Secret Service.
I agree. And I would describe his design philosophy as technological expressionism. So
That's
he
great.
based,
Yeah.
yeah, like that's how I've often described it when I talk about his contributions to the series. And I would also say that in part because of him, but not solely because of him, I've always seen the first 20 James Bond films, of course, that includes ones that he didn't directly work on at all, as funhouse commentaries on this madhouse known as existence. He sort of was the embodiment, if we want to talk about an artist who worked behind the scenes to make the James Bond movies what they are, he was an embodiment of everything I just described. He sort of understood that there are crazy megalomaniacal people in the world who will put the world at risk to pursue their crazy dreams. And so I'm going to show that because here's a small example of it. The villain is willing to kill everyone in the room, like you just described in the rec room that turns into a
And
gas
speaking of
chamber.
megalomaniacal villains,
Yeah,
Ken Adam then got hired by Stanley Kubrick to production design Doctor Strangelove,
which is another
which
great set.
feels like Bond sets.
Of
It feels like
course.
they're doing the movie on Bond sets. But interesting that Doctor Strangelove and the Peter Sellers character, they all feel like they could have come out of a
That's right.
more 19, maybe 80s Bond scenario. But the sets are definitely classic Ken Adam.
For sure. And he was also a war hero, by the way. He was a German Jew who joined the British Air Force and kicked some Nazi ass. And he got to do
And
that in the James Bond movies too, in some
And when
ways.
you see interviews with him, he's the coolest dude ever.
Yeah.
And by the way, Taschen put out this amazing and I don't own it, but I would love to get my hands on it. It's like $1,000, and it's signed by him. This amazing book on all his designs throughout his career, but with the emphasis, I think it's just Bond in this particular book, or it may include Strangelove and other things. But it's an incredible book if you can
Oh, I'm
still
gonna have to
find it.
look that up.
Yeah, if there's somebody in your life who loves Bond, that's the ultimate gift to give them if you've got $1,000 to spare.
Well, Ken Adams is my favorite production designer of all time, so I guess I should get the book myself.
You should,
Yeah,
because he signed like 1,000 of them, and there may only be a few available still. So I would get on it.
I'm
It
definitely gonna look into that.
and I've seen it in the store. It comes with its own stand. It's
Oh,
very
wow.
impressive. Yeah, and then Gert Frobe was phenomenal as Goldfinger. Just again, just a fantastic, iconic villain, and again dubbed because nobody could understand a word he was saying on the set.
That's right.
And I love the Hannah Blackman interview where she talks about they get on the set and they do the first bit of dialogue, and she's thinking to herself, I have no idea what this man's saying, but I think my piece of dialogue goes right now, so I'm going to say it. And he's so well dubbed in Goldfinger.
He is.
And I can't remember who dubbed him, but I think it might have been an English actor putting on like where does he originate from? Is he German, Austrian, something in that vein?
Well, he's a Nazi, put it that way.
Yeah. He's very turned on by the Nazi gold that Bond uses to bait him on the golf course.
That's right. And by the way, that is one of the funniest scenes in any of the Bond films. And I just love how well paced it is and how clever it is, where Bond uses Goldfinger's,
Yeah.
he uses his
Gold,
cheating
yeah.
to bite him in the ass, right? So
And
I
that's
think
obviously right out of the Fleming novel.
yeah,
And of course, we can't ignore Odd Job, which also leads me to take a few steps back to From Russia with Love, because I forgot to talk about Robert Shaw as Red Grant. And how can you talk about From Russia with Love and forget Robert Shaw? So that's a cardinal sin. But Robert Shaw as Red Grant, I think, forget Jaws or any of the others, I think is the most formidable villain in all of the Bond movies. That guy is so cold-blooded
he
and
is.
so lethal. And Robert Shaw plays him so effectively that you get chills every time he's on the screen. And the scenes where Bond arrives at the train station and he's telling, I don't know who he's telling, that they need to bring an agent over to like assist him. And Robert Shaw's shadowing him. He's on the train and Bond's on the platform, and he's slowly walking behind, and he's over and he's listening to the conversation. It's one of the creepiest scenes in all of the Bond films. And all the way from when Lotte Lenya as Rosa Clare punches him with a knuckle duster, and he has
Yeah,
almost
that's great.
no
I love that
reaction.
moment.
And she's shocked, and she goes, "He'll do." And then the final, obviously, this is a fight of legend in the James Bond series in the train compartment,
Yes.
is an amazing feat of stunt work, cinematography, and editing. And that's
Yes.
Peter Hunt's editing there on show. It's such a great sequence. This could be in any super serious, realistic film where you really fear for James Bond's life. And bringing it back to Goldfinger, the final confrontation in Fort Knox in the vault between Bond and Oddjob, I think is every bit as thrilling a fight as the
That's my
train
favorite
compartment
henchman fight for me personally.
You know, when people talk about the best fight in the Bond series, they always go back to Robert Shaw on the train, but I think they gave short shrift to the Oddjob Bond fight, which I think is, it's not in tight quarters, but it's absolutely thrilling.
No, it's my favorite because it's the most unusual in some ways.
And
like
Bond
even the fact
takes
that he gets
as much-
electrocuted in larger
Yeah.
than life fashion. I love in general larger than life flourishes. So
And Bond gets punished and beaten by Oddjob so badly as much as he does by Red Grant in From Russia Love. I mean, and you feel those punches of Oddjob just like karate chopping him and throwing
Yes.
him around. And it's so smart the way he electrocutes him. And apparently, Harold Sakata, who played Oddjob, when he grabs the bars and Bond is electrocuting him, his hand was on fire or something, but he kept holding on because he didn't want to ruin the scene. I
that's
think
dedication.
he had like second or third degree burns on his hand after the scene. And he said, well, I just held on until you said cut. Harold Scott was a wrestler, so when
Yes.
he dies, the way he falls and hits the ground is fantastic. It's not
It
a
is.
stunt man. He's just face forward, like hits that hard floor. It's
And
such a
I
great.
and I also love how John Barry punctuates that scene so well, where again that glittery, tongue-in-cheek
Yeah,
music
yeah.
plays when
And of
Odd Job
course,
is like, so full of himself and it's like, give me your best shot, right?
yeah.
It's so well done.
The only other villain in terms of like how impervious to being overcome that matches Our Job was Jaws when you look at the physicality of these characters that you
Yes.
thought that Bond could never take out. I mean, like punching Odd Jobs, and there are many times in the series where there's this big tough guy and Bond punches him and he gets no reaction whatsoever, and then punches him another 4 or 5 times. I mean, on a Majesty Secret Service is full of that. It's a trademark of the series that Bond's going to go up against some like Goliath, pound him, and the guy's going to have no reaction, and then he has to figure out a smarter way to take him out. I guess it started with Ray Grant, but punching Odd Job is like really like he's punching a wall. And how is Bond gonna overcome this dude?
And the countdown sequence is
Yeah.
magnificent.
Now
Um,
that is a point for Harry Saltzman, by the way, because it was Harry Saltzman who changed it from where the nuclear bomb counted down. They were going to stop it at 004 seconds. And Harry Saltzman said, no, it's got to be 007. So there you go, Harry Saltzman.
I'm telling you, he deserves more credit. But the thing is, I also love even just minor moment by moment things that happen. So, for example, the little touch of having the paid for soldier squished between the vault door and the steel bars, which just a little great moment, a little
A
detail.
violent moment. You
Yeah,
mean
but
one of
it's so memorable.
Goldfinger's mercenaries?
That's right.
Yeah.
But it's so well, I mean, I guess he was a paid for soldier and or henchman. Like, what do you call his private army?
Mercenaries.
Yeah, mercenary. Okay, yeah, whatever you want to call him. But the point is, that's a
Yeah.
great moment. And of course, the actual raid on Fort Knox with the airplanes and the
Yeah. Those were real soldiers that they went onto that base and paid to be in the scene. Apparently, they all got $10 in a meal or something.
well, that's cool.
Yeah.
But and the other thing,
Some of their collapsing is a little dodgy acting wise, but I forgive it with the mood and the score and
oh, it's just
everything
so
else.
well done. Yeah, I couldn't care less about that. But the other thing is, I love the pacing of this film. I think it's immaculately structured and paced. Um,
Even the very end where Goldfinger's in the plane and he's been sucked out already, and Bond goes into the flight cabin and Pussy Galore is just like she's given up on controlling the plane, and the plane is like descending towards the water, and we're like, well, how are you going to get out of it? Are you guys going to go and get a parachute anytime now? I'm sure Peter Hunt cut that one as well, right? I'm not sure.
yes, no, you're
But
right.
then it's just that jump cut to the plane hitting the water and exploding, and then cutting to Bond on the grass with Pussy and he's starting to kiss her. I don't know whether they filmed Bond going for the parachute at any point, but Peter Hunt just made that creative choice. I'm just going to cut out of it. And
It's brilliant.
Obviously James Bond survives. It's the third Bond movie. We know he's never going to be written out of the series.
And
But
every aspect of filmmaking comes together. It's consolidated to create something that's not only new in terms of its flavor, but in terms of how smooth everything is operating. So, for example, in that same sequence that you described, you've got all these cute lines like where Sean Connery's Bond says, "Are you having lunch at the White House too?" to Goldfinger, right? Like all those cute moments.
yeah, and when he's on the ground, I've always loved that exit from the movie where he throws the parachute over them and said, "This
That's
is no
great.
time to be rescued," I think is what he said.
Yeah,
Or like she was trying to
magnificent.
summon the plane. And it's the typical Bond exit from all the Bond movies, except for one, which when we come to it, we'll talk about it.
Yes.
In watching Goldfinger in 4K, I became aware for the first time of how many rare projection and process shots were in the movie that in the highest resolution just really stood out. Like all the driving, but also on what's that famous hotel where Bond first meets Goldfinger? I forget. They did like second unit.
Yeah, I
Well,
know what you're talking about.
I don't think Connery was ever there, but the actor who plays Felix Leiter, they did some quick shots of him there. But then they built the rest of it on stage and used these rare projection backdrops, and they look very fake by obviously by today's standards, but seeing them in high resolution. And there are times throughout the Bond movies when you see that they go back and do a pickup or they want a better reading of a line and they are using a faked in background. And they really pop, but not as badly as You Only Live Twice, which is chock full of them to the point that it becomes so distracting. But Goldfinger still works fantastically.
Well, yeah, because before the 1970s and the 60s were a transitional period, but realism hadn't dominated, the cinematic,
The effects work anyway.
Yeah, and
The
so
downside of that effects work, if you know how the post-production process works, anytime a shot in those Bond movies had to have an effect put into it, like for example the laser beam coming out of Goldfinger's laser, they had to go to a second or third step in copying the film. So those scenes in 4K, when you see the wide shots of Goldfinger's laser shooting between Bond's legs, they look almost blurry because they're not like the rest of the transfer being taken straight off the negative.
Yes. It's a great set piece, though.
It's fantastic. And it's also foreshadowing the laser because then they do use the laser to cut open the door of Fort Knox.
That's right.
All of it pays off. But it's got one of the greatest Bond exchanges between Bond and villain, maybe the most iconic again of the series. So much of the stuff is iconic when Bond says to Goldfinger, what do you want from me? Do you expect me to talk? And Goldfinger's exchange, no, Mr. Bond, I expect you to die.
Yeah, it's great.
And wasn't that imitated in all the Austin Powers movies?
Yeah, and also You Only Live Twice was parodied maybe more than any of the Bond films, but that definitely is an aspect. Yeah. I was just also going to add that Sean Connery's performance in Goldfinger, I think, is his best performance as Bond. But even if it's not his best, I just want to say that in general, Sean Connery,
I think he's most confident.
Yes, Sean Connery in general, whether he's playing James Bond or any number of other great characters, is just one of the great screen presences, I think, of all time. I think that he's right up there with Humphrey Bogart and, let's say, Gene Hackman in terms of just being able to be this very confident,
absolutely,
larger than life, caustic figure, because he's got a sense of humor. To me, the humor part is very important because it allows him to be smooth. It's one of the things that allows him to be smooth. But just like Humphrey Bogart could just, glide through a movie, making witticisms, so can Sean Connery. And he's able to level these witticisms against people very well, very effectively. So I just think he's one of the coolest people in film history on screen.
Yeah, if you're holding up five fingers, he's definitely among them. I mean, Sean Connery, in whatever he did, was an iconic actor, and really unfortunate that he never got any awards recognition for his performances in Bond, that it had to take all the way to the Untouchables for him to win an Oscar. I don't even know if he got any nominations before that period. I'm not sure, but Sean Connery,
I love him in The Untouchables, though, but I agree with you. He should have been nominated and or won for other roles for sure.
And also talking about who never got nominated for the Bond series, John Barry.
Yeah, that's ridiculous. That's crazy. He should have won, not just been nominated.
He should have won many times over. And the fact that all those iconic Bond songs never got a single fucking nomination. And then you get into, what was the first nomination? Was it for Spy Love Me, I think?
No, Live and Let Die was nominated.
Oh, Live and Let Die, which is a good Bond song, but I don't think anything that came after John Barry was anywhere as great as what he did. I mean,
John Barry's the greatest film composer to work on the Bond films. I still like other
I'll take it one step further. For me, he was the greatest film composer ever worked in film, period. I don't care what genre he worked in.
He's my third favorite, tied with a few others, but I love him immensely, so you're not going to get much of an argument for me in terms of his greatness.
Yeah. I mean, when you talk about the iconic scores, the diversity of scores that he did, the Bond scores, but then he did a different kind of secret agent, Harry Saltzman produced, the Ipcress file.
Yes.
Which had a very different stripped down score. But then Barry scored for Body Heat, one of the greatest film noirish scores of all time, which interestingly enough is coming out on Criterion in 4K in a few weeks. And then my favorite Barry score of all time, at least shared with Francis, is Out of Africa, which is
It's a
a
great
landmark
score.
score. And then Dances with Wolves. So many just incredible scores that this man did. Won 5 Oscars, 2 for Born Free because of the song. He won The Lion in Winter. He won Dances with Wolves.
Out of
And he
Africa.
won Out of Africa. And then he was also nominated only one other time for Chaplin. And
That makes
whereas
no
John
sense. That
Williams,
record makes no sense.
yeah, John Williams has like 98 or over 100 nominations and has won, I think, as many as Barry,
Five.
which was
Yeah,
5. And there's so many great scores. And even with Barry, the mediocre movies he scored had phenomenal scores, like Raise the Titanic.
that's right.
And although it's a popular movie now, Somewhere in Time is a terrific Barry score. I mean, they're,
He should have won an Oscar for Goldfinger for both the score itself and for the song, tied with the other people who collaborate with him on it. And then he should have won probably for at least two other Bond films. And he should have been nominated for every Bond film he worked on, in my opinion.
in the 60s, in the swinging 60s, John Barry was James Bond. John Barry was the guy who drove the Aston Martin or something, I think it was Aston Martin in London, and he palled around with Terence Stamp and Michael Caine, and he was the guy with the beautiful women on his arm, and he married Jane Birkin. I think he was married I think 4 times, I want to say, but John Barry was a ladies' man. And maybe when you look at him in his later years, you don't see that as much. But in the 60s, John Barry was considered one of the most attractive and I don't want to say an eligible bachelor because he got married so many times, but John Barry was as much a ladies' man as Michael Caine and Terence Stamp. They were like this trio. They would meet at the same clubs in London, but they partied all night. But then the work ethic of this man, he would be scoring like 5, 6 movies a year, and every one of them would be masterpieces of
Yes.
scoring. He never phoned it in on a James Bond
No,
movie.
he never
Every
skimped.
single
No.
every single Bond movie has a magnificent new theme. It's infused from the title song into the score. Let me tell you something. As much as I love James Bond, the name that I looked forward to seeing on the poster the moment a new Bond poster came out was who did the music. And if John Barry's name was not on the poster, it was a big like, oh, fuck. But
Yeah.
when it was on the poster, it was now we're getting Bond.
Yeah. No, definitely. That's why when he left the series, it was never the same for me. And it's the same thing with Ken Adam and a bunch of other people. It's even the same when it comes to Bernard Lee not being M anymore. I get very attached to some of these people. To me, they're staples of the series. When they leave, the series isn't the same anymore. Every
Yeah,
departure diminishes, even though, again, I'll say this countless times, I love the first 20 James Bond films, but I'm just saying when certain people left either behind the scenes or in front of the camera, to me it made each, subsequent installment a little bit less special or a little bit less official. That's just how
yeah.
I've always experienced the series.
Well, I mean, you're a lot younger than me. So when the first Bond, I wasn't born when the first Bond movies came out, but I think by the time You Only Live Twice came out, I think it was just coming into this life. The first James Bond movie that I saw in a theater that I was old enough to go see was Live and Let Die. I wasn't even young enough for Sean Connery in First Run. And so, in a way, Roger Moore was my generation James Bond. And I already was familiar with Roger Moore from the TV series The Persuaders and The Saints. I was already a big fan of Roger Moore. And I loved the early Roger Moore contributions. But by the time I got a little older and started putting it all into perspective, it was definitely Sean Connery for me. So it's really impressive to me as a guy as young as you that you still get the Sean Connery-ness of it.
Well, first of all, the first Bond film I ever saw was Diamonds Are Forever, taped off television, and on the same VHS tape, my dad also taped A View to a Kill. So those were
And
the
how
first two.
how old were you when you saw that?
I would say approximately five. But the thing is, the first Bond film I saw in the theater was Tomorrow Never Dies. But it wasn't the first
Wow.
Bond film I had ever seen. The first Bond, like I just said, the first two that I saw were Diamonds Are Forever and A View to a Kill. And then I also saw, because there was a James Bond marathon on television, I saw them in order, starting with Dr. No, and I think it ended with License to Kill. So they literally every week they'd play a different Bond film, and the first James Bond film that was rented from the video store was by me, I mean, or by my family, I should say, was GoldenEye. So
Well,
there you go. But I think we should now go to Thunderball.
yeah, Thunderball, which I have to say that for many years, up until very recently, when I rewatched Thunderball in 4K, Thunderball was not one of my favorite Bond films. I enjoyed it for Connery, I enjoyed it for the specter of it all, but I always felt somewhat underwhelmed by Thunderball, even that it was not one of my favorite Barry Bond scores, even though that's grown on me so much. But when I watched Thunderball again, which was only maybe a month ago or something on 4K, it was like watching a whole new movie. The underwater stuff was so clear. I could see who was doing what to who at the end. The movie flowed so much better. I actually loved Thunderball so much after watching it recently that I was sort of kicking myself for not appreciating it as much. And in fact, the way I used to think about Thunderball is now the way I think about You Only Live Twice, because I watched You Only Live Twice right after Thunderball again in 4K, and everything that had become better about Thunderball for me got worse with You Only Live Twice, which we'll talk about in a moment when we get to You Only Live Twice. But I think Thunderball is, I would say, my as Casino Royale and From Russia with Love on the top tier, and then my next favorite Bond movie is On Her Majesty's Secret Service, and then I put Thunderball. I think Thunderball is phenomenal.
Well,
And
Thunderball is tied with a few others for my second favorite Bond film, although I can always break the ties if I have to. So I would pick a different one, not Thunderball as my second favorite if I only had to pick one favorite. But I was also going to say that it's a good thing you've come around and now you love Thunderball because it was the Bond film that was released the year you were born. So,
I,
so you there you go. It's a mystical occurrence. You know,
I've
you were
always
destined to
loved
love it.
I've always loved the title. It's such a James Bond title. And Claudine Auger, who is the main Bond woman in Thunderball, I think is the second most beautiful Bond actress to ever play the
She's
role.
gorgeous for
I
sure.
think she's absolutely stunning, and she's got a beautiful screen presence. I don't know. I think she was probably dubbed as well. I'm not sure about that. I'm sure the information is on the internet, but she's absolutely one of my favorite Bond women. But she is just so beautiful, and I think she was Miss France. I think she's French, right? Whereas Goldfinger sets up the outlandishness of the James Bond series, Thunderball sort of pays off on it, and now we're into supervillain territory. This is the movie that really is the beginning of what's known as the Blofeld trilogy. Now, I got to talk about this for a second because I think one of the biggest mistakes the Bond series made, and I know it wasn't necessarily done intentionally, it was about logistics, was filming You Only Live Twice before On Her Majesty's Secret Service, because they totally ruined the timeline of the Blofeld trilogy. And that also pertains to Bond going to Japan in the novel to seek revenge on Blofeld for killing Tracy. The whole timeline of that is messed up. And I wish that they had just even not made another Bond movie for that year and held off so that they could make On Her Majesty's Secret Service before You Only Live Twice. And then, interestingly enough, we would have had Connery doing On Her Majesty's Secret Service, but I'm not going to go there yet. But it really messes with the timeline, and it creates a flaw in On Her Majesty's Secret Service as far as the story mechanism of how does Blofeld not recognize in the movies James Bond when he turns up imitating Sir Hilary Bray, but
Well, the
clearly is
answer
James
is because
Bond.
he's played by a different actor.
It's not acceptable to me on an intellectual level, and the only
My
way you
answer
can
is a perfect answer, though, you have to admit.
no, 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 because because you are playing in the reality of the world, and it totally defies credulity that that can happen unless you interpret it as they both that.
These are meta artistic
I
characters.
know,
They know they're
but
in a
I
movie. No,
don't
I'm
have a
joking. I'm
problem with it
joking.
as much. I don't have a problem as much from Blofeld's point of view as from how stupid James Bond is. Like, James Bond goes to all the trouble to take on Sir Hilary Bray's identity, flies up to Blofeld's lair in the Alps. And what does he expect him not recognize that he's James Bond if you go by the timeline of You Only Live Twice, where Blofeld clearly encountered Bond? So I'm just trying to get my fucking head around that one. And at one point in the script, they were going to try and justify a different Bond lead by that Bond, in order to track down Blofeld, had plastic surgery and turned out as George Lazenby. And I wish they had done that just for the pure logic of it. But then he would have had to have plastic surgery again to
Well,
become
the real
Connery
reason, yeah, but
in
the
Diamonds
reason
Offer.
the reason why James Bond has a problem recognizing Blofeld in On Her Majesty's Secret Service
It's
is
not
because he's.
Bond recognizing Blofeld, it's Blofeld recognizing Bond.
Oh, sorry, that's what you were gonna say.
Yeah.
Okay, so never mind. Yeah, well then, if that's the case, yeah. Well, there you go.
But let's just get back to Thunderball.
Yes.
Again, on display, according to people who shower disapproval on the old-time James Bond films, when Bond is in Shrublands, the health clinic where he's recuperating there, his behavior towards the masseuse, Pat, could be considered very rapey by contemporary standards, even though it's this game that Bond women play with Bond, where it's almost a standard, where the women play hard to get, and Bond persists, and eventually they give in. And then Pat is even pissed off when she thinks Bond is catting around the health clinic looking for other women.
Yeah, and it's tongue in cheek, though. That's the other
It's tongue in
important thing.
cheek. It's tongue in cheek, but I can also see that Bond is very handsy toward her. And this is in all the movies from this period, Rock Hudson comedies and all these kind of movies where these guys are all over these women and the women seem uncomfortable with it until they're not. So which way is it? I'm never quite sure with these things. But because of the title of our show, the movies they won't make anymore, I do want to highlight certain aspects of each movie which seem dated by standards of behavior today. That one, Bond is pretty handsy on her. I will concede that, because she does seem like she's got no time for him at first. But it always comes around to the fact that these women really do want to be seduced by Bond. If, again, that is the buy-in of the James Bond series.
Yeah, but it's funny because...
Yeah.
Oh, go on.
No, I said don't go and watch a James Bond movie if you can't accept that conceit of what James Bond is about.
That's true, but also I'll just make a more general point. When it comes to a work of art being deemed outdated, I would just like to remind anybody who believes in that term that on a long enough timeline, every work of art becomes timeless depending on the individual in question's subjective reception of the work. Meaning, we enjoy works of art today, and when I say we, I mean some people, obviously not everybody, that are thousands of years old. And obviously they contain social mores, let's say, or the depiction of social mores that are not in vogue anymore. But we are able to put those differences aside and still enjoy the timeless aspects or the visionary aspects of the work of art in question. So it's the same thing with the James Bond films. In other words, I don't like the term outdated, just like I don't like the term corny. I think that they are very imprecise terms when used by critics. There are more detailed ways of expressing approval or disapproval of a film. If something is deemed outdated, there's a better way of describing what the individual in question doesn't like about the work of art. That's just how I feel about it. Because like I said, if we're going to say that movies that are mere decades old are already out of date, then what does that say about works of art that are thousands of years old or hundreds of years old? It doesn't really make sense. So it's basically a failure on the part of the judge or the critic than it is on the work of art in question. That's how I look at it, generally speaking.
I don't think that is as much the question or the quandary that I find myself in today, where if I was directing a Bond movie today, I don't think I would have a scene like the Shrublands seduction of the masseuse, but it's about being able to watch the Bond movies from that period and still enjoy them and not feel guilty or dirty for enjoying them, which I absolutely do not. I
Neither do I,
feel,
partly for the reasons I just expressed.
I mean, they were
So,
very
yeah.
sexy. They were very sexy. I understand. My buy-in is that James Bond is a character. He's a sex machine, so to speak. It's part of his identity, and these women are very entranced with him. I'm buying into all of that.
And
I'm
it's not
enjoying it.
depicted perfectly seriously. So
Yeah,
therefore, there's a lot of leeway there.
I think if you're making a Bond movie today, I find them too sterile, too
Yeah,
sexless. But I think there's a way to bring that back, but do it in a classy,
that's fine.
a classier way where there's more evident consent right from the beginning, as opposed to maybe a little bit less putting hands on women until they've consented. But you can have that where
Yes.
the women are still into Bond and very forward and very they just have to announce that a little earlier and have a little less protest, I
Yeah.
guess. But I still have enormous enjoyment from watching these movies, and no moral majority or virtue signaling group is ever going to make me not enjoy these films for what they are.
No, and also they're missing the larger point of these movies, which is that they are about glorifying Western civilization and defending Western civilization, which, to be honest with you, is probably what people would be more objecting to today when it comes to the James Bond films. Because a lot of people, unfortunately, want to destroy the Western world. They basically are less interesting Bond villains.
And I think I think even today I think a Bond movie would never go there. I mean, Hollywood movies went there in the 90s where Muslim fanatical villains like in True Lies who wanted to destroy Western countries or whatever it was, or
Yeah, accurate depictions, even though they were also satirical in that particular movie, but
right.
they're also accurate. The thing is,
But
though, you don't even
but
need to
they would
talk about
never,
Islamists. You can
yeah,
look at
they would,
just Mao suit wearing villains.
yeah. Today, Islamists would definitely like to destroy our way of life and our country
Of
and put us
course.
all under Sharia law.
That's
Islamists.
right.
I'm not
That's
saying
right.
Muslim people, but Islamists.
That's right.
The Bond movies wouldn't touch that today because it
No,
is
they're too
too much.
tame. Yeah.
It's too much a hot button issue that will turn into accusations of racism and
But in the 20th century, the James Bond films were fearless. They would go after any target. Any target. The Russians at the height of the Cold War and all throughout the Cold War, they were brave films. And even in Thunderball, the threat of nuclear weapons being used is no laughing matter. You know, in 1965, it's not too long after the Cuban Missile Crisis, the movie was not shying away from important real-world
right.
geopolitical conflicts. So I love Thunderball. I love the title.
Thunderball. Thunderball is really the start of the most outlandish villain plots, including using plastic surgery to create a
I love
different.
that moment where the double shows up and gasses
Yeah,
the real
but I
guy.
mean, I don't think it's possible even by today's technology to recreate somebody else's face on somebody else. But even back then, and of course, there've been more contemporary Hollywood movies like Face Off, changing faces and doing all this
Yes.
stuff. But this started with the Bond movies of suggesting that plastic surgery can literally recreate somebody else's face. And like you said, then this Thunderball has this super evolved heist. You know, it's basically almost like a Dark Knight, I think, like heist in midair and then crashing the plane, and then moving the nuclear weapons underwater. It may be the first, and I wonder if it's the only Bond movie that really shows you the details and the mechanics of the villain's plot and how he puts it all into motion. And I appreciate that so much more in the 4K version of Thunderball because you can really see so much detail of what they're doing now and who's underwater and who's doing it to what.
And John Barry's music is incredible during
Yeah,
the final underwater fight sequence. It's
John
incredible.
Barry was a master of jazz. He was a master of space music, and he was a master of underwater music. His score to Thunderball is fantastic, as is his score to The Deep. Raise the Titanic has underwater scenes.
Yes.
He understands the slowness and the mystery and the mood of underwater scoring. And for me, any movie that features scenes underwater, knowing that there's like sharks nearby, already there's a moodiness and a creepiness to it.
And I love it in the Bond movies when the villains feed people to exotic animals.
Well,
I
that's
think
why
that
that's such a staple of James Bond movies.
that's
That I
right. And
wanted
then
to bring that up
the
to
Daniel Craig
discuss
movies
is
started to get rid of that stuff, which I don't like personally, because
yeah,
I
no.
love that.
Thunderball and sharks go hand in hand. And in fact, if you hear Ken Adam talk about it, the scene where Connery's in Largo's swimming pool, they send the sharks in, and he had only a small plexi protection. He didn't have enough or something to go around. And one of the sharks actually gets into the pool with Connery. Connery literally is in the movie with a real shark, and they're all screaming at him, "Get out of the pool, get out of the pool." It was like, to hear Connery said, "In 5 seconds I was dry." He got out of the pool that fast, and then he had this wry comment, "Well, that never happened again."
Well, my favorite scene in Thunderball is the Blofeld scene where he electrocutes
Yeah,
one of the Spectre members. I love everything about that scene. The Ken
but
Adams
that
set is
yeah.
incredible. The method of execution is highly imaginative and satirical. I always have to emphasize that satirical element. Of course, this scene is directly from the novel.
Was this the start of villains executing their henchmen, which is the most
No,
preposterous thing when you
also a
think
Goldfinger.
about
By
it?
the way, I forgot to mention when we were talking about Goldfinger, the great execution of Mr. Solo.
But Solo wasn't on Goldfinger's team. He was a guy that Goldfinger wanted to do a deal with.
Yeah, but close enough.
Yeah, but then it started out like if you were on a mission for a villain and you didn't pull it
No,
off,
From Russia with Love. It happens in From Russia with Love.
that's true. There you go, Kronsky or whatever
Kronstein.
his name.
Yeah,
Yeah,
Kronstein.
Kronstein.
And by the
Yeah,
way, my favorite scenes in From Russia with Love are the Blofeld scenes. So that's a recurring element with me.
but
I
I
love
just to go back to the exotic animals, I think they peak where everything is thrown into one movie, and this is why I love this movie so much. Live and Let Die. To jump
Yes.
forward a little bit to Live and Let Die, has snakes. It has sharks. It has alligators. It seems like Live and Let Die threw them all into the movie at the same time. And that's what I love about it. It's so,
Yeah.
and as an animal lover, seeing animals, predatory animals, used as sort of vicious killing machines, it's about the only time I can stomach it in a James Bond movie because it's so over the top. I hate these shark movies that have turned the world into thinking sharks are these hideous killing machines when really it's humans who are doing it. I hate these films when they use lions to hunt people down, and all movies, bears, and movies that use wild animals to try and suggest that they're the real villains and man-eating creatures out there. That's a position reserved solely for man. And somehow I find it palatable in the Bond movies, except like when they kill the spider in Doctor No. I found that very offensive. But Thunderball and sharks, and I love sharks. I have a huge love for sharks and alligators, fascination with them
Same.
both. And
Ever since I was a kid. And by the way, these films are probably part of the reason why I do like those exotic animals and always have.
And in Thunderball, let's not forget that Largo executes one of his men for failing to kill Bond by
Yeah,
throwing him
throwing
in
in
the
the
shark
shark
pool,
pool.
too,
That's right.
which was a real stuntman thrown in. They paid him a lot of money to be thrown in a pool with the sharks. It's amazing when you
How much
think
did they
about
pay the shark? No, I'm joking.
they should have paid the
Or
shark.
sharks, I should say. Yeah.
It's amazing when you think that some of these most amazing man-eater stunts in the Bond movies were done for real, like the Live and Let Die.
He ran over the
He
alligators and
ran over, and
crocodiles.
not
Yeah.
once. He did it like 3 times or something. He literally ran over the alligators. It's one of the most. I think that's one of the greatest stunts in movie history
It
that
is great.
people would think were animatronic alligators or not. No, those were real fucking alligators.
That's right.
Getting back to Thunderball, Adolfo Celi, another great Bond villain, the eye patch, and again, I believe dubbed. I think he's dubbed.
And by the way, it's funny how just a simple thing like an eye patch makes a villain iconic.
or started that today, that would be like, this is an impaired person that you're making fun of.
Yeah.
I mean,
And then-
almost every villain choice in a Bond movie today would be criticized. Goldfinger has been making fun of a fat man or an overweight man.
Yeah, there you go.
But
Or his gold
I love
fixation.
that.
It's not his
And
fault.
Largo is yet another of the very cultured Bond villains.
Yeah.
I always love the scene before the villain turns physical against Bond, when they always invite Bond for lunch or dinner. There's always a moment of measuring the size of Bond's nemesis. So
Yes.
Bond's always going for lunch. The man with the golden gun, he has that, instead of Scaramanga shooting Bond down when he's arriving at his island, he does shoot him down, but he doesn't kill him right away. And then he invites him to lunch. There's Dr.
Yeah.
No has Bond to dinner. And if you notice that Dr. No, they never get to eat. Because
He's too busy
Bond
talking.
Bond starts insulting him,
Yeah.
and I think they've got a little like hors d'oeuvres on the plate, or grapes or olives or something. I was like, "Where's Doctor?" I was curious to see what Doctor No was going to feed them.
That would have made it hard for the continuity person, though.
Yeah, same thing. But in On Her Majesty's Secret Service, Bond's having dinner at the top of his glory in that revolving floor where they bring the dinner table over. There's all you could talk about how many dinner table scenes that Bond has with the villain.
Well, in Octopussy, you get to see what they're eating.
Remind me, what were they eating?
I think it's a sheep head with, the eyeballs that the
Oh,
villain
okay, all
shoots
right.
at.
That's okay. I was thinking of Bond and Octopussy, what they were eating over there. No, okay, yes. That reminded me of Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom.
Which I also love. That's a great scene.
I love that. It's a very, in a way, Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom is a very Bondian Indiana Jones. It's my
Well,
favorite.
Indiana Jones is Steven Spielberg's James Bond.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
that's a whole other can of worms. But
yeah.
going back
But
to Thunderball, I just also wanted to say that the title sequence is my favorite. Sorry, it's my second favorite. Tie with You Only Live Twice. My favorite is Goldfinger. But the title sequence for Thunderball is, I think, in some ways, the most, or one of the most iconic. Yeah, Goldfinger would be the most iconic, I think. But this one's probably the second most iconic just because it's been parodied so much. The woman swimming in the water with, people having various phallic weapons pointed at her, right?
yeah.
It's ingenious, and the use of color, and of course the images are set perfectly to the music.
We should talk about the fact that the title song was originally going to be Mr. Kiss Kiss Bang Bang. And I think Shirley Bassey sang a version, and then was it Dionne Warwick, or there was another singer. And as they got close to release of the film, they started to panic that the title of the movie was not mentioned in the song, and that people wouldn't understand what Mr. Kiss Kiss Bang Bang was, which was the way Bond was referred to in Japan. And Barry had a whole different composition for that. And so they went back and they redid the title song for Tom Jones to sing, and uses the Thunderball theme, which I don't even know if the Thunderball theme existed before they went in and redid the title song, because Mr. Kiss Kiss Bang Bang had its own theme. And then later on in the Carnival Chase, that was originally scored to Mr. Kiss Kiss Bang Bang.
Yes.
And on the recently released La La Land complete Thunderball soundtrack, you can actually hear the alternate track where the Carnival Chase incorporates the Mr. Kiss Kiss Bang Bang theme. So that was some fascinating last minute changes, but I think Tom Jones singing Thunderball is a fantastic
Yeah, I'm glad they I'm
James
glad
Bond
they
song.
used his song for the actual released film because I prefer it, even though I like the other piece of music
It's
too.
such a surreal song. I mean, it kind of makes very little sense, but the
Well,
lyrics
again,
are,
it's a poetic meditation on megalomaniacal impulses.
yeah, and it's definitely got the James Bond, John Barry title song energy.
Yeah, it's
It,
thunderous and it's
yeah.
bombastic in a good way. When I say John Barry can be bombastic, I mean in the best way possible. Just
Oh,
like when Max
absolutely.
Steiner was that way
Absolutely.
too.
John Barry's bombastic is still so listenable. It's so,
I
and he's
mean it
just
as a compliment when I refer to his music as bombastic, I mean it as a compliment.
very brassy title songs, very high energy. I mean, John Barry was the master of the orchestra and coming up with the great thematical hook.
Yes.
Even Jerry Goldsmith, when asked, who would you hire to score a movie you directed? Right away, he said John Barry, because John Barry can compose the best themes.
Well, that's a great compliment.
Absolutely, because Jerry Goldsmith is probably, I would say, maybe my second favorite composer. I think he was magnificent.
He's one of the composers tied with John Barry for my third favorite film composer.
I think Jerry Goldsmith was the most accomplished composer, the most original. He had the most dynamic palette and could always come up with just the perfect sound for any
Well, he
movie.
was very Stravinskian. And he's basically post Stravinsky and post Bernard Herrmann. Because really, if you think about it, Bernard Herrmann's his precursor in many ways.
It's interesting.
And Alex North definitely influenced
Yeah,
him.
well, especially A Streetcar Named Desire.
Yes.
But what's very interesting is when Jerry Goldsmith composed Medicine Man, one of my absolute favorite Goldsmith scores, starring Sean Connery, and I really think it's an underrated movie. I like the movie a lot. His score is very Barry-esque. There's a scene where Lorraine Bracco and Sean Connery are like hoisted up into the trees and they're
Yes.
looking for these special flowers. The music just soars, and even I think maybe Goldsmith might at some point, or definitely Goldsmith fans, compare it to a very John Barry-esque theme. And so Jerry could definitely do that John Barry sound, that lush, romantic, sweeping music that Barry became known for. They say later in his career, but it was really always present in his work.
I agree.
Especially in the Bond movies.
For sure.
And then also in Thunderball, it's got a great villainess, Fiona Volpe, played by Luciana Paluzzi, who's very sexy and very ruthless. And I want to talk about an aspect of the Bond movies that I find fascinating and might also be deemed controversial today. They kill a lot of women in the series. In almost every Bond movie, there's sort of an innocent woman that dies. The female villains all get taken out. And in going back to Goldfinger kills two sisters. He wipes out an entire bloodline.
That's a good point.
I don't know if there were any other Mastersons left alive, but there are ruthless, and of course, painting the woman gold, there are ruthless killings of women throughout the series. I mean, we could probably go through every Bond movie. If it's not a female villain getting fed to the piranhas or something, it's like Martine Beswick being murdered in Thunderball, Corinne Clary working for Drax getting killed by the dogs. I mean, it's throughout the series.
Well, put it this way, if the Bond villains often are willing to kill the world's entire population, then it just shows you what they're prepared to do.
But it became like a flaming plot machination where women are vulnerable, and it's frightening to see them preyed upon by these predators like Oddjob or whoever it is. Drax.
Well, yeah, the Bond movies don't shy away from reality. Ironically, they often create larger-than-life symbols to comment on reality. That's why I said before, I see the James Bond films, specifically the first 20, as funhouse commentaries on this lethal madhouse known as existence. Because it is a lethal world that we live in.
Yeah, I mean, even Plenty O'Toole in Diamonds Are Forever is drowned. That's even not counting her getting thrown, we'll discuss that one, but thrown out of a Vegas hotel room into a swimming pool.
That's right.
She survives that, but later on she's murdered as well. I mean,
that's right.
It is a fascinating aspect of the cruelty that Fleming infused into the movies. There was a certain grittiness of it that people were playing for high stakes.
Well, he was a spy. He was a real spy.
Yeah.
So he knew what, and by the way, it's very interesting to me that he actually did real espionage, and yet he didn't decide to do realistic spy novels. Instead, he decided to make larger than life, Edgar Rice Burroughs style adventures. So I think that's very interesting.
I saw an interview with him.
The world is not enough.
Well, he felt if he used the real stuff that he had witnessed, he would have violated the Official Secrets Act. And he also didn't want to get prosecuted by the British government. So that's why he also came up with more outlandish stuff.
Yeah. And also, I think he wanted to satirize the villainy of the people that he was up against in real life. And he did it in a very iconic, larger-than-life way. You see, the reason his creation, James Bond, no matter how he's represented in print or on screen, the reason James Bond became the world's most popular spy, fictional spy, is because, actually, I would say he's probably the world's most popular spy, period, right? I don't think there's a real-life spy who's more famous than James Bond. But anyway, I think part of it has to do with the fact that there is a fantasy element, not just to the character, but to his adventures. I think if he was just mundane spy, there'd be nothing to talk about. I think it's because he goes after the worst, most grotesque villains, because he gets to bed these seductive women, because of all this larger-than-life stuff, he becomes this icon for the ages. And it's the same with Sherlock Holmes, by the way, right? His adventures, his detective cases were colorful.
Every great thriller or spy adventure or film that features some kind of villainy is defined by how good the villain is.
That's right.
And Ian Fleming was a master
Yes.
of coming up with these fantastic, outlandish, colorful villains that you'd think would be easy to do because there was years and years of films and literature, but somehow the James Bond villains really stood out. And of course, the James Bond character himself. I mean, a little bit like when you talk about Batman and the Joker, you could also interpret James Bond as being a little bit psychopathic too, but just a few inches on the line from the madness that becomes the villains or becomes the Joker. He's every bit as qualified as a killer as these bad guys that he goes after. And then the template of James Bond, you couldn't have movies like Indiana Jones and the Mission Impossible series today
Correct.
without James Bond. Fleming tapped into something that was so seminal in terms of creating an interesting, complex protagonist. Because while the Roger Moore movies definitely diluted the complex psychology of James Bond, I think it was really palpable in the Connery films and slowly came back to that, at least in Casino Royale for me, and maybe they tried in the rest of the Craig movies, but Daniel Craig was trying to play James Bond as a three-dimensional, complex human being, whereas I don't think that ever really occurred to Roger Moore, except maybe in For Your Eyes Only.
Yeah, and just speaking for myself, because I am more drawn to the larger than life aspects of the James Bond cinematic and literary universe. I don't care about that three-dimensional aspect as much. To me, it's the iconography, the larger than life exotic iconography that matters. Just like I feel the same way about Edgar Rice Burroughs' Tarzan novels, and I also feel the same way about the superhero movies and comic books. To me, this idea of a well-rounded character when it comes to certain characters is not that important. And Jorge Luis Borges, the great writer, he agreed with me to a certain extent. He preferred Robert Louis Stevenson's characters to Proust's characters because he thought that a well-defined, iconic character can actually mean more than a character whose every habit is chronicled. It's not necessarily important. Like Long John Silver from Treasure Island is an immortal character in a way that no character from In Search of Lost Time is. It's just a
But
fact.
but Ian Fleming's version of James Bond was exactly what you said, very precisely chronicled. If you read the James Bond novels, you come away understanding Bond's taste in alcohol, his taste in cigarettes, his taste in diving equipment. James Bond is a completely fully evolved character in the novels in terms of his preferences.
Well, in the
Also,
films too, though, to a certain extent.
yeah, Terrence Young really brought that aspect to Bond, his precise tailoring of the suits. But I think all of that starts in the Fleming novels. Fleming was basically projecting himself into the heightened reality of the Bond adventures. He was a very cultured man. Fleming, I believe, went to the same schools as Bond.
Yes.
Uh, and then Fleming takes this fully evolved character who he could answer any question about his likes or his dislikes and plugs him into these heightened reality plots.
That's right.
And that's what makes it work so well, is because we feel we know, especially the James Bond of the novels, we know this man. And in the novels, he's a ruthless mechanism of the Secret Service. He is his own person, but Bond understands that his end game is that he's doing what he's doing for Queen and country, and which is why he has to ultimately stay a bachelor. But he uses sex and he uses violence and he uses state provided wealth, because when you see Bond in the movies and in the books, he's staying at the best hotels. He's wagering huge amounts of money
Yes.
at casinos. He's traveling luxuriously, but he's ultimately a civil servant, probably not making very much money as an agent of MI6. And so James Bond has the ultimate expense account, clearly. That's the persona that they're presenting publicly of this man, of a cultured gentleman. And Fleming takes that character and drops him in with some of the sleaziest, unsavory creatures to
Correct.
ever emerge from the human cesspool.
And by the way, that actually brings up another point for me, especially when it comes to the films. Bond needs to be suave. If he's not suave, to me, that's not James Bond. I'm just speaking personally. So, for example, that's what I like about Sean Connery, Roger Moore, Pierce Brosnan in particular. But yeah, I just wanted to point that out that to me, that's what differentiates Bond as a film hero. That he can, for example, be particular about what drink he orders and
But
how.
Bond was suave, but he was also lethal. And I think Craig in Casino Royale really sells that for the first time for me since Connery. Because as much as I love the Roger Moore Bond films for the rides they are, and Live and Let Die features very highly in my Bond ranking, I think it's like fourth or fifth, I never felt that Roger Moore's Bond was ever intimidating. I never felt that he was dangerous. I think he
Yeah, but
gets by.
he makes quiche. That's pretty intimidating.
He gets by in situations because he is a bit of a wise ass and he's very suave and maybe he can handle himself in a fight. But there's only glimmers provided of Bond's toughness in the Roger Moore series, like when he slaps around the character of Andrea, played by Maud Adams in The Man with the Golden Gun. And apparently even Roger Moore was uncomfortable doing that. But speaking of things that are seen as pretty much transgressive by today's standards, Bond does a lot of slapping of women when he's trying to get information out of them or bring them over to his side. And again, that's part of the James Bond buy-in, is that Fleming definitely defined him as a kind of cruel figure. James Bond was not above doing
That's right.
what needed to be done to achieve his goals on the behalf of England. So Connery played him with the perfect synthesis of toughness, of charisma, of attractiveness. When Bond fights Grant in From Russia with Love, if I was a guy who was just observing that, knew nothing about James Bond, knew nothing about the ability of Red Grant, I would be curious as to who was going to win that fight because I would find them equally formidable. Except Connery feels a little bit more sly. But a lot of these...
well, he's my favorite Bond actor, no question.
Without doubt. But what's also interesting is in a lot of these mano a mano to the deaths with these so-called supervillains in the Bond movies, which are generally the henchmen and not so much the lead villain, Bond tends to win the day by luck at times, by like his hand landing on the briefcase and able to pull out the knife to stab Grant, or finding himself knocked into the side of the wall where the electrical wiring is flaming, where he can electrocute Oddjob.
Well, he's inventive.
He's able to take advantage of the moment. He's a quick thinker. He understands science, how science can kill people, whether it's fighting Jaws on the train and electrocuting him with a lamp in the teeth. And his own smarts and education is what actually betters the day for him against some of these less educated villains.
And that's a perfect transition to our next Bond film, You Only Live Twice. So we'll pick up with You Only Live Twice in our next episode.
I look forward to that.